Now that we've got all of our tracks imported and labeled and organized and put into group tracks, it's time to go through and do a first pass of setting all the levels, or how loud are the tracks in relationship to one another. So if we switch over to the session view, we can look at the meters. It can be helpful to expand these out so we can see a little bit more information or a little bit more detail here. So the end goal here is that I don't want my tracks to be hitting any higher than this -6 on my meter scale over here. The reason for this isn't going to be the final stage of the process. So we're going to move into mastering, and that's when I'm going to be thinking about bringing up the volume of the track to the level that I want it to be at. And once we move into the mastering stage of things, it's much easier to turn up the volume on the few things that we need more of than it is to turn down the volume on all the things we want less of. So by having plenty of headroom by the time we get to the end of mixing, we're really going to save ourselves a lot of grief when we move on to mastering this track. So I have the first thing I do is approaching setting levels is I'll go through and I'll mute everything out, even including the groups. Just make sure that nothing is going to make a sound that I don't want to have make a sound. And then I'm going to bring each of these in one by one. So let's just go through and make sure these are all muted out. Good. And let's collapse this down and let's start with the drums. So I'm going to start with the kick drum. It's going to be the easiest one to set. Let's unmute its group track, and let's go find a section where this kick drum is playing on a regular basis. Let's see, it looks like starting at measure 10 here, we've got a consistent loop, so let's run from there to there, and then just get that looping. So there's our kick drum making sound. And then before I unmute it, I'm going to bring the volume slider all the way down, unmute it, and then start to bring that volume slider back up. In this case, I'm just watching my meters here, particularly the master meter. I'm going to bring this up to sit right around -12 as the peak amplitude. Somewhere right around there. And I'm going to mute this out for a second. So what we're actually seeing here on these meters is we're seeing the relative loudness of this track. And in Ableton, we're actually seeing 3 pieces of information. We're seeing the peak history, which is that top green line there, showing us the last few seconds of audio, what has been the loudest moment accomplished. Then the darker green underneath that is showing us the current peak amplitude of how loud is the actual moment that we're currently hearing in audio. Then the brighter green section there is our RMS meter, or root mean square, and this is showing us a little bit more of an average volume of the overall track. Now that root mean square is really useful because it's a little bit closer to how we perceive the overall loudness or volume of a track, that we don't necessarily hear the discrete peaks of a signal, but we hear the average volume of the track overall, and that's how our ears kind of respond to, is this track loud or is this track quiet? But it can also be helpful to look at what is the dynamic range that this track exhibits, and that's what we can see with this the peak versus the RMS amplitude there, so we can get a little bit of a feel over how much dynamic range we have within the track, what's the loudest to the quietest of the track, because that RMS is going to kind of give us the average of that, as well as the peak is going to give us the peaks of that. So now there are some nicer metering plugins out there. They'll give you a little bit more detailed information about the track, and those are definitely worth looking into once you get further down the line and you're getting a little bit more comfortable with what's happening. One of the ones that I like is made by, if I go into my plugins, audio units, this one I think is a plugin alliance, the BX meter. If I drop this onto here, we can see it's showing us a lot of similar information, where I can see here's my peak, here's my RMS, and then in the middle I'm constantly getting this display readout of what is my current dynamic range, of what's the distance between my peaks and my valleys. So that can be a really useful tool, and there's some other ones out there as well, but this is one I've been enjoying working with lately. So let's go ahead and close that out for the time being. So now that we're reading this display, keeping in mind that the end goal here is to have my peak amplitudes, so this darker green plus the kind of history there, not going much above -6 decibels. And if I was being really conservative, I might shoot for -12 decibels. Now, kind of fair warning, this is going to require that you have a quieter environment to listen in, or that you're in an environment where you have some sort of external volume control where you can bump up the volume being fed to your headphones or speakers so that you don't have to rely upon making your track louder at this stage of the game to be able to listen comfortably, because things are going to sound a little bit quiet and they'll get louder later on. So now that we've got that going, let's bring this back in. There's our kick drum. Let's bring in the rim. Let's go find a spot where that rim is a little bit more active. Let's actually jump here more towards the end where everything is happening. Let's loop that much. And then same thing, bring down the volume all the way on the rim, unmute it. And now I'm going to use this technique that I call the penduluming technique, where I'm going to over-exaggerate the volume in both directions. And what I find is this helps my ear kind of focus in on the aspect of the sound that I'm currently setting. So by making it too loud, I'll be able to identify, yes, that's clearly too loud. Then by making it too quiet, I'll again be able to do the opposite and identify, yes, that's too quiet. And then I'm going to kind of slowly rock in or pendulum about until I find that sweet spot in the middle. So let's try that with the rim here. Too loud. I could probably, ooh, yeah, it's definitely too loud. Now let's bring that back down until it's too quiet. And really find these extremes. Like that's too quiet. And let's bring it back up. We'll go just slightly too loud this time. And use just your ears. Don't worry about your eyes at this point. Settling it down again. Just a little bit past too quiet. Coming back up. Just a little bit past too loud. A little bit too quiet. Somewhere right in there. This is probably something that I'll come back and tweak again later. We're just getting a general level, but hopefully you're getting the concept there. Now let's do a little bit faster with the snare. Unmute, bring the volume all the way down. Right in there, then look over at our master meter, see how we're doing. When that snare kicks in, we're almost at -6. So let's bring down our overall drum mix. Remember that we've got this all grouped up, so here's all of our individual drum sounds, and each of those tracks passes into our group track here. So if I notch this down, I can bring it back down, make sure we're in check there, and I'm just peaking out right around -12, which is where I want to be on the modest side of things for now. Great, so there's our drums. Let's collapse that down. Now let's bring in the next sound. Let's see, maybe let's bring in our bass sound over here. So same thing, bring down the volume, start to sneak this thing up. Too loud. Somewhere right in there, let's bring in the guitar. Great, and lead. Let's see, is this happening at this moment? Yep, it is. That's right. We've got a group track here. Start with the flute. Great. Finally, our pad. Actually, I don't think this is happening yet, so let's leave that down. Go to our brass. So right around there, keeping in mind that things aren't going to sound incredible at this point. We're just going for a general level because we haven't even really moved into mixing yet. We're just setting our levels. So things are still sounding like they need a lot of help. So the last thing is we need to set in this pad. So we got to jump back to when that pad is actually happening. Let's get a little bit afterwards. Get that section looping. Bring in our pad. That kind of seems like a mistake to me right there. That shouldn't exist. Alright, so I think that's a good level to start working with. We're going to keep tweaking that as we move through our process. Looking again at the master track there when we've got everybody in here at the last break. I think that brass could come down a little bit. We've got plenty of headroom there when we move it into the mastering stage of things. So that's our initial setting of gains and the penduluming technique, and now we're ready to start moving into the first dimension.